Welcome to the Awakening Together channel here on YouTube. We're so glad you found us. This video is a part of a mini-series at Awakening Together, a non-dual community based on awakening to the one true self. The speaker today is Akilesh Ayyar, and his website is siftingtothetruth.com. He shares on the powerful technique of self-inquiry in this video. We hope you enjoy this teaching and will visit us in our sanctuary online at awakening-together.org. On the main menu bar, look for Online Sanctuary. Then in the drop-down menu, look for Enter the Sanctuary. There's a clickable link right there for you. Hope to see you in the sanctuary.
Right. Thank you so much, Saina. And it's good to see you all again. Those of you who have been here for one of the previous sessions and those of you who haven't. Sort of in a format quite similar to the last two sessions. The very first session I covered the idea of self-inquiry. The second session I covered the idea of surrender. And today I'm going to do a recap of both real quick. And then what we'll do is we'll do a little practice just like last time, and then I'll take questions. And we'll see where it goes. And I might open up the questions after our practice to any questions that touch on non-duality more generally, and especially if anybody has tried these practices, on their own time outside of sessions and how that went. I'd be very curious to know if anyone has tried that and has comments or questions or anything like that. So just to give my very, rapid 60,000-foot overview of non-duality and the approach I take to it. Basically, once again, there is essentially this thing called the egoic illusion. And the egoic illusion is the sense that you have that you are, you're the person that you think you are, basically, that you are in control of your life, that you're experiencing it, that you are the entity that experiences and does. And the basic concept behind non-duality is that there is an ability to, in some sense, penetrate past this illusion. The illusion is kept up by the mind's tendencies to seek happiness in the outside world based on its identity as a person. And that sort of keeps the mind spinning. And through the practices of surrender and self-inquiry, and other things as well, but especially those two, the mind is led away from the outside world as the locus of finding its happiness, and is led to progressively look inwards. And as it looks inward, it enjoys greater and greater peace from the inward contemplation. It seeks less and less its happiness from the outside, and eventually, as a result, the illusion of the separation that underlies duality is slowed down and eventually can be seen through. It's sort of similar in a way to if you have a flip book, and you're flipping through it, it creates the illusion of motion. If that motion becomes slow enough, then suddenly it's seen to be the illusion that it is. Or you have another example that just came to mind is that there's a very, very famous ancient example of taking a torch and spinning it around, and that creates the illusion of a circle of fire. But if the torch becomes slow enough, it's seen to be just a torch and there's no circle of fire. So in something, these are just metaphors, but the basic idea is that whatever practice we use, it has to steer the mind away from its usual attachments to the outside world and its attachment to itself as the doer and controller of actions, and its attachment to seeking to be absorbed in various thoughts. So the spear tip of the search, as I like to call them, as I like to call these two techniques, are surrender and self-inquiry. And in order to practice them, there has to be kind of base of some other stuff, and what that base is can differ for different people. So there has to be some kind of basic intellectual framework. It could be as basic as what I've just told you, if that's sufficient. But some people need more in the way of details. I certainly did. But if there is faith based on a very, very bare bones framework, that's enough. And if someone is willing to practice the practices, I ideally at every waking moment, then that's sufficient faith. So there's an intellectual framework that might be required to different degrees for different people. There is a degree of emotional stability and psychological health that is required. Now, it's certainly not perfect psychological health that's required. It's not a perfectly quiet mind that's required either. But to a certain extent, a certain ability to concentrate the mind is required, and how much of it is required before one is able to practice fully differs from person to person. And it's not as if there is a watertight separation between the spiritual and the psychological. As you practice surrender or inquiry, that can increase psychological health. And conversely, if you increase your psychological health, that can increase your capacity to practice. So it's kind of virtuous cycle that way. So I mentioned these things as just sort of background points you should keep in mind. The reality is that if motivation is extremely strong, then you are free to practice surrender and self-inquiry directly and not worry about any of the other stuff. It's only when there are obstacles to the motivation of practicing these practices continuously that we have to look at other things. Okay, so I'm going to go over again very quickly my deceptively simple instructions for self-inquiry and surrender. And then we're going to practice, and I'm going to ask you to choose whichever one you want, and or to try both and shift between them and see how that feels. So self-inquiry, once more, is the practice of, in your experience, looking for your sense of awareness, trying to localize it, trying to locate it. And as you try to do that, the cardinal rule is that if you believe you have found it, you ask yourself of that thing you seem to have found, is this something I'm aware of? And if it is something you are aware of, then that can't be you. That can't be the true thing that is aware of it. So for example, if it feels like, oh, I'm in my head, well, my head and the feeling that I'm there, is that something I'm aware of? Yes, it is. And so that can't actually be in your experience anyway, experientially, in the game of self-inquiry. That can't be where you are because you're aware of it. And only where there's a distance between you and the object can you cognize an object. So when you know, oh, I feel the sensation in my head, you also simultaneously know I'm not the sensation in my head. Just like you know I'm not this table because I experienced this table. And yet you also know simultaneously I'm here because I feel the sensation in my head. Therefore, I exist as the knower of the sensation in my head. So I must be here somewhere. I'm experiencing not just the sensation in my head, but I'm also experiencing my own self as being aware of it. So where is that self who's aware of the sensation in my head? And then you look again, because it's somewhere in your experience. You know that you exist. You know that you're aware. So where are you? So self-inquiry is this hunt for you in your own experience. You just hunt for the source of your own awareness in your own experience. And it's a relentless focusing and refocusing, because as you try to hunt for this, you come up with a series of objects. Each object is something you're aware of. And then you keep recognizing, oh, this can't be me. And again, you refocus on whatever feels like you. You try to refocus anyway. You try. So it's this hunting. You're following and following and following. That's self-inquiry. Surrender. The way I describe it is, again, I think he's used this metaphor in the previous last session, which is there's a television on in the corner, and that television is playing everything that's going on in your perceptions, in your thoughts, in your feelings. Everything is going on in the TV. And it is not your job to turn the TV off. It is not your job to change the channel on the television. You don't need to accept it. You don't need to say it's great. You don't need to say it's fantastic. And you don't need to notice every detail on it. All you need to do is recognize that everything that is going on in your experience is on the TV, and then refuse to be drawn into it completely. So that is, quote unquote, ignore thought and this is really a flip side of the coin. I'm really repeating myself by breaking into pieces, but and relax. And by relax, I mean not that you have to feel relaxed, but that you have to refrain from using your willpower on anything except the practice of surrender. So the practice of surrender is continuously recognize this moment is an experience. Do not allow yourself to become engrossed, fully engrossed in the experience. So sort of, make sure that there's a recognition that, oh, this is just an experience. And refrain from using your willpower to engage with the experience. So things that happen unconsciously, involuntarily, automatically, spontaneously, that's all fine. But where it feels like, oh, I have to exert my ability to do something in a burdensome way, don't do that. One metaphor I use, which seems to click with some people, is the idea of, in surrender, you can view yourself as kind of, royalty. The king or the queen doesn't do things. They have people to do things for them. So the truth is, you should envision yourself as essentially sitting on a kind of throne, and the mind is trying to trick you into getting off that throne and doing the things of life, the burdensome, effortful tasks of life. And it is your practice and surrender, basically, not to get tricked, essentially. So you're ignoring thought, continuously ignoring thought. And when you ignore thought, you have to recognize that you are being lured into, being engrossed in thought again and again and again and again and again every second. And so your attempt to not be hypnotized by thought has to renew itself continuously every second. You can't be like, oh, I've ignored a thought, I'm done. No, your effort has to be continuous. So you do apply your willpower to one thing. That is the continuous that this is just an experience, and the refusal to allow your attention and your willpower to be sucked into it. Instead, you sort of cross your arms and say, view yourself as rather what you think is as yourself, normally your conventional self, right? As someone over there, 10 feet over there. And that person can deal with life. It's not your job to deal with life. It's their job to deal with life. And they can deal with it however they like, or not deal with it however they like. In surrender, what we're trying to do is trying to detach ourselves from the idea that it's our job to handle that person's life. Okay, so that's a quick recap of self-inquiry and surrender. And so now what I'd like everyone to do is I'm going to set a timer for about 5 minutes, and you can choose to practice whichever one of these appeals to you, or both. You can try shifting between them. And afterwards, I'll take questions and comments about how that experience went. And maybe I'll also open the floor to other questions and comments more broadly, perhaps. We'll see. So I'm going to set a timer right now for 5 minutes. And I would suggest, I usually suggest, because these practices are meant to be done ideally for seekers continuously. So they're not basically sitting practices. They're not basically, oh, I'm going to do it for half an hour sitting down. And you can do it that way at the beginning if you like, and if that appeals to you. But basically, these are meant to be practices that are meant to break the usual identity as a person, basically. And so as a result, if you want that to happen, they're meant to be done continuously. And that's difficult. I know nobody can do it perfectly immediately. It's a gradual process, but that's the attempt. And so in line with that attempt, I tend to encourage people, if they're practicing, to practice with their eyes open, because that's more sort of exportable to real life scenarios, basically. Now, if you can't do it, if you want to keep your eyes closed, it's fine. Even just like a sitting practice is also fine. But if you keep your eyes open, it can be more it can have more value in terms of being able to take it into real life. So anyway, I'm going to set the timer for 5 minutes starting right now. All right. So would anyone like to share any experiences or have any questions about what just happened? You can raise your hand, I think, by hitting the reactions button, and then, yeah, just raising your hand, and then I can call on you. Shauna, hi.
Hi, Akilesh. Thank you. I noticed that the two practices really support each other within me, that I did go back and forth to surrender, relaxing, and then back to the questioning. What am I? And when I see a thought, and I noticed I saw the thought arise. I didn't think it, and just go beyond that thought. Just go beyond, let that go. Don't engage it, let that go. And then I noticed I was engaged in a thought. I didn't even realize I did it. Oh my God. And then what is it that realizes that? It just naturally, oh, I'm engaged in thought. And then let that go and go beyond. To me, it's like go beyond and then surrender, relax again, relax again. And it seems like it takes a lot of effort at this point.
Yeah, well, that's right. Thank you. No, that's exactly right. It sounds exactly right. It does take a lot of effort. And precisely what you just said is what happens, which is you recognize kind of after the fact that you have gotten caught up in a thought. You're like, oh yeah, that. And then you drop it, and then it happens again and again and again and again and again. And that process eventually becomes more and more automatic. So it's very effortful at the beginning, especially. And it also is effortful, more effortful where it hits on things that are more important to you, basically, and where it feels like it's more important that you exert your sense of personal control, which is, as you pointed out, like, oh, it's not really that I thought a thought, it's that a thought arose. Well, exactly. So that's the case with all thoughts, actually. And so that's, part and parcel of the truth that, the idea of personal control is an illusion. But, it can be extremely compelling as an illusion, especially where it comes to things that are important to us. And so this is kind of, there's an element of artificiality in an exercise like this, where, of course, you've already carved out, space from our usual obligations and worries. And so we're not likely to encounter, a threat to a serious attachment, like in this setting right now. But yes, thank you so much, Anna. Others? Barbara, hi.
Hi there. Oops, here we go. Hi, thank you so much for doing these. I really liked the royalty, because what I found from that is I found myself saying, I'm watching myself do this. I'm watching myself think this. The way you said it's someone else doing it, and the royalty is sitting on the throne. I'm watching myself. I'm watching that person do this. I'm watching myself do this. Puts me in a different place when I'm saying I'm watching myself do that, then that person is other than me. And I really liked that a lot.
Good. I'm really glad. I will add just one other, it's always tricky with every metaphor has its problems. It's very, very true with non-duality, especially. But I will just add, right? So this notion that, even though I myself use that metaphor, right? This notion that you're watching yourself doing X, Y, or Z, right, is also a thought. So, we don't want, it can be fine initially to think that way. It's fine, but we want to recognize we don't want to get absorbed in that thought either, because ultimately what we're trying to do is we're trying to recognize some kind of exit from thought, essentially. And so the idea of being the witness will eventually become kind of tedious trap eventually as well. And so we want to just recognize that the idea that I'm witnessing is also a thought, and ignore it. So,
Very, very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, Martha.
Hi, Akilesh. this time, since this is the third time I've done this with you, and this time I almost felt like I just plain couldn't go anywhere. Like I was sort of spinning in space, because every time I asked a question, I realized finally that if I could answer the question, I couldn't be the question. And so, right. And so I just kind of came to, I don't have a clue. I do not have a single clue who I am. So it was kind of different, because the last two times I've gotten some kind of this image, and it was like, okay, wait, but then I got the image, you know, so that's still a thought. And this time it was just like, nope, got nothing. I got nothing at all.
Well, okay, so that's, I mean, that's great. That's actually very interesting. So so you're doing inquiry and you didn't get an image. You had the sense that I have no idea who I am. Well, the thought that I have no idea who I am is a thought, right? And so you ask yourself, it's answer just like any other answer. And so you would ask yourself, am I aware of this? And of course you are, right? Because it's that, after all, it's you who knows that you don't know who you are, right? So there must be some sense that I'm aware of this fact that it seems like I don't know. So this idea of I don't know is arising as a thought, and you have to recognize, oh, but I'm somehow aware of it. It's as if, you know, and forgive me if I've used this analogy in one of the previous sessions, but it's so apt, right? It really is like it's as if you're carrying around a flashlight, you know, and you're looking for the flashlight, okay? You're looking for the flashlight. You're carrying around the flashlight, and you're shining the flashlight on a banner which says, I don't know where the flashlight is. You know, the banner is illuminated by the thing you're looking for. So totally understandable, of course, you don't know. Obviously, that's totally fine. It's not something which you are meant to immediately know, but it is something which you are meant to see the riddle at work, which is that you're right here somehow. And so you know your state of not knowing. The knowledge of your own state of not knowing is somehow known to you. So it must be somewhere, you know, and so to relentlessly refuse to regard it as futile, but to keep looking, essentially, would be inquiry, right? Keep over and over recognizing. And I'll tell you one other thing, right, which is also relevant, you know, which is that surrender and self-inquiry are, as someone else said, I think a moment ago, highly interlinked. And in my opinion, they're really two sides of a coin. And one way of looking, if you're an inquiry and you're at an impasse, okay, like I don't know where to go next. One way of looking at where to go next is that where you currently are is a thought. And what you can do is you can effectively, quote unquote, surrender it. Because when you surrender your current experience, you are moving away from experience. And there's only one way you can move when you move away from experience, which is towards the experiencer, which is the subject, which is what we're looking for in self-inquiry, basically, which is the, you know, the locus of the egoic illusion. And so if you don't know where to go, one way of looking at where to go is away from wherever I currently am. So if this I don't know thought comes up, for example, what if we just ignored that thought, recognized it as a thought, and ignored it? That would be moving in the right direction, basically. So you can keep doing that, you know, and that's always going to work. And you know, so just as, for example, just as self-inquiry essentially is asking the question, where am I, or who am I, or what am I? You know, surrender is implicitly asking the question, what isn't me? What does it mean for something to be a thought? What does it mean for something to be an object of experience? And these are questions that imply each other. So when you have an answer to one, you have the answer to the other. Others? Feel free to ask questions, by the way. I mean, I'm going to open up the questions further. We'll see if anyone has them about non-duality more generally, or your experiences with these practices on your own time, if you have any. Arizona? Oh, I think you're still on mute, I think. You're still on mute, as far as I know.
Oh, sorry, I was on mute. You gave me the challenge all week to do it. And all week long, it was like the mind is blank. Unless I absolutely want to think, then I can think. Otherwise, my mind is always blank. Can you explain why that is?
Well, so
It's been like that for 50 years.
right. I think you mentioned that. So the question is, were you keeping that up every waking moment?
Naturally, I don't have to work at it. It just happens naturally.
Right. But what I was asking was, but the challenge was to do the practice, right? Was it not?
Right. When you ask a question and nothing happens, it just floats on by the question.
Well, so for example,
If you're doing
inquiry,
actually sit down and actually study that question, then I get thoughts.
oh, okay, but self-inquiry isn't exactly a question like that, right? So self-inquiry is saying,
I'd have to actually sit down and think about it because nothing else would follow it. As a thought, it just goes blank mind.
so the question is, to whom is the blank occurring?
Okay.
Right? Do you see that you're experiencing the blank?
No. Because it's been like that.
When your mind goes blank, how do you know your mind is blank?
Because there's no thoughts running through it.
Yeah, but who is it that knows that fact?
Me.
Exactly. So the me is obviously aware of the blankness. You see that?
Mm-hmm.
So where is the me?
Don't know.
Exactly. So that's what self-inquiry is looking for, right? You know that your mind is blank.
Mm-hmm.
So self-inquiry is trying to say, well, how is it that I know that fact? Where is the me that knows that fact? I somehow know that my mind is blank. Do you see that? That knowledge that my mind is blank is somehow in my experience. So that means that I am not the blank mind. I am separate from the blank mind. If I were the blank mind, I would not be able to know that my mind was blank. There has to be a separation in order to know something. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So the you that's aware of the blankness of your mind, that's somehow something that you know, like at some intuitive level, at somewhere, somehow you know it. And so self-inquiry is like trying to locate in your own experience, where is that knower, the knower of the fact that your mind is blank.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make any sense?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Sure. So that's what inquiry would be. So inquiry would be continuously hunting that.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Others? Oh, okay. I see. There's a question in the chat. So Ayan asked, wouldn't the converse, the witness stance, be the stance engage with the thought object / thought fully and penetrate it completely? Penetrating completely will show that no object doesn't exist other than I. Wouldn't this be another way to do self-inquiry? Let me try to understand this. So the converse, the witness stance, either stance engage with the object or thought fully and penetrate it completely. Penetrating complete will show that no object doesn't exist other than I. The no object doesn't exist other than I. So that, I guess, I mean, I'm not 100% exactly sure what you're driving at, Ayan, with the wording of the question here, but I can sort of try to guess at it. So So it seems like what you're saying is if you engage with the object of thought fully and then penetrate it completely, meaning it sounds like a state of intense concentration. So if you concentrate on something intensely, then in some sense you quote unquote become it, right? I think that seems to be what you're saying. And there isn't a normal separation between the I and the object. While that is true, I think that is actually accurate. The problem is that how should I put it? That can't be sustained unless you are able to do it with a continuous stream of objects, with all the objects continuously. And the problem is the objects are changing. So, so for example, right, this is what people often ask, right? Like, oh, if you're intensely involved in some activity in what's called, people talk about flow states, right? There can be such states of profound concentration and absorption that temporarily it no longer feels like your usual sense of separation between you and the world, basically. It can feel like an effortless state of flow. That is a great state, but the problem is, from the spiritual standpoint, is that it's linked, or it's linked to that specific object. Let's say, like, you're a great, I don't know, violinist. Then, in certain moments when you're playing the violin, you may become so concentrated in the playing the violin that you no longer experience a sense of separation. That's true. That can happen. But that's not going to help you destroy the entire chain of attachments that links you to your usual identity, because you'd have to be in that state about playing the violin continuously, which you can't be, because that's just not possible, essentially, physically. So this idea of let me engage with every object and fully concentrate on it, you can't really, you can't get there unless you have something steady to concentrate on, basically something which is going to be there in every situation. And that's what surrender and inquiry give you. They give you something which is a fact of experience, which is always true, which is in every experience, no matter what the changing experience is, it's a fact that I somehow am experiencing it. So self-inquiry can always be operational. Similarly, in surrender, we're like, okay, well, this is experience and I'm ignoring it. Well, there's always some kind of theater of experience, so we can ignore it. It's very difficult to envision how it is that one can fully concentrate on every object continuously. There's no way that I can think of to do that except by destroying the egoic illusion at its root, essentially. So it's a nice thought, Ion, but I don't think that actually works, because what happens is you get concentrated in a particular object and you lose yourself there. You need to have something which permits you to not be lost in the vagaries of any particular object, but to sustain concentration continuously. So I don't think it works, basically, is I guess what I'm getting at. I hope that wasn't too complicated. I hope that answered your question. Other questions? It can be a non-duality generally, and if there are no other questions, by the way, I'll just do another practice session and we'll see how that goes. So all right, so let's do another practice session, see how it goes. So I'm going to do another 5-minute timer, and feel free to practice either inquiry or surrender, and we'll go from there. So here goes. All right. How's that for people? Anyone want to comment on their experience or have any questions? Shauna, hi.
Hi. My experience this time was in the inquiry, I was trying to, there's that doer, focus on the fact that I exist. I know I exist. There's something here that's alive. And then immediately the mind would put a concept to it. So I just, well, what's beyond that? What's beyond that? What sees that concept? And then I remember surrender, relax, because the doer got in here. You're doing it wrong. You got to do something different. And so I was just going back and forth, trying to remember to go beyond and not, and what's the seeing all of that.
So I will say, so that's great. Thank you. I will just note, right? So, when you say the doer got in here, what can you explain? Can you say more about that?
Yeah, it's a specific energy that tightens in the body, and it's a restlessness, a wanting to do something different, especially the voice that says I'm doing it wrong.
Right. So okay, that's interesting. There's multiple things going on here. So, so one thing I will say is the illusion of doership, okay, is not something that we can voluntarily give up. It is because the one who would voluntarily give up is the illusion. So the only thing that we can do is we can concentrate our effort, basically, right? So the idea is that, concentrate our attention really is what it is. And that's why it is an effortful process. And it's okay for it to be an effortful process. Now, that said, and I'm going to use an analogy here in a second, but that said, if you do find an uncomfortable feeling, for example, occurring in the body, then you can certainly relax that if you like, or you can inquire into who exactly is it that's experiencing this uncomfortable feeling, or you can switch to surrender like you perfectly well did, and that's also an option. But note, right, that even with surrender, there is still, at least from our current perspective, a doing involved. You are doing this practice called surrender. Now, in the end, it will be found, if you follow it all the way down the line, that what seemed like a doing of surrender was actually, in some sense, your true nature. That surrender and inquiry are actually continuous, ongoing processes. They don't actually, they don't require effort. But the effort that seems to have gone on will only eventually be revealed as effortless. Currently, as a seeker, it will seem like it's effortful, and that's okay. That's totally okay. It's required, because the basic stages of the spiritual search are, I use this metaphor often of a lake, right? And the lake is broad and it reflects many things. It reflects far away things and it reflects close by things. And the far away things it reflects might be like mountains and trees and things like that. And the close by things might be like, maybe bushes, and then, whatever else that's close to them, and then maybe you. Okay. So the first and largest stage of the spiritual search is our attention is usually dispersed on many, many things. And, so you can view them as being, we're looking at like the reflections of the mountains and clouds and things like that. And what we want to do is we want to increasingly concentrate our attention on a narrower and narrower circle of things. And that's what inquiry and surrender do, because they're like trying to turn the attention from the many and the outward to the inward and the fewer and the fewer and the fewer. And when it comes to very close to focusing on effectively like one thing, and you're still using your effort to do that, but as soon as you get to that one thing, when your concentration has become focused enough that it's effectively one thing, then you experience a state of profound silence. That state of profound silence is not exactly the self just yet. Why? Because it's a state, meaning that it comes and goes. It is it's still in time, right? Like, oh, My mind was noisy. Now it's focused and quiet. And it will be noisy again, perhaps. But that state of profound quiet is important because it is like looking at the reflection of the self in the water. Then you have to go further and ask yourself, who's noticing this reflection? And there's a different movement then, which you can't compel, you can't make happen, but will happen when it is time for it to happen, which is basically when your attachments have been sufficiently weakened that you are capable of allowing yourself to see the truth in some sense. Then there's a different movement, which is, you might say, quote unquote, out of the reflection to a recognition, oh, I'm the one being reflected. And then you're no longer dependent on the state of quiet mind anymore. I mean, you may still enjoy it. It's still be a fun experience, and your mind will tend to be quieter. But my point is that prior to that point, effort is required, and you are, in fact, in the illusion of doership, and there's nothing you can do about that except to use that illusion to focus on one thing instead of many, and to focus on inner instead of outer, and that's the movement we want. So, thank you. It was very helpful. Others? Remember, you can use the reactions thing to raise your hand if you, or you can put things in text if you prefer. No problem at all.
Glenn?
Oh, hi, Glenn. Yes. Thank you, Sena. I think you're on mute still.
I am. I'll turn the mic on.
There we go.
There we go. I have a tendency to turn my mic off. It's been really helpful to me to do this, ignore, or like recognizing and ignore, or like practice. It's been so helpful to me. It's like, because I don't get into a desire to change or make different. And then the relaxing is so appealing to me, personally, I guess, that it's like, oh, so there's nothing, it comes into like a nothing to do. Everything's like copacetic, and I can observe and like participate and make choices without, in this relaxed state. And even this last practice, this sense of like joy and appreciation for like existence or whatever. I don't know. I want to put a label on it, but this sense of like excitement and joy kind of like bubbles up, and I'm like, this is fun. This is interesting. Everything is interesting. When this ignore and relax, it's like I feel like I'm more participatory as opposed to scared and needing to control or like shoot, like defend, or any all those reaction responses maybe don't seem to happen. And it's like, oh, this ignore and relax has been really super like helpful to codify a method that I've been So go ahead.
Yeah. So one thing so absolutely. So thank you for sharing your experience, and you're absolutely right. So there can be, and this is the idea that peace and joy will well up, and things will be, copacetic. Exactly. The one thing I would just say, however, is as that peace and joy wells up, ideally what we'd like to do, because if the goal is not any particular state of peace and joy, but some kind of underlying recognition of that is permanent. Basically, we can't be content with anything less than that. That see what happens is, so the peace and joy wells up, which is great, and then, like you say, then there's a bit of a temptation, I would say, to let that express itself by going out and engaging. So when you engage, unless I'm misunderstanding you, you're then sort of temporarily relaxing the ignoring of thought, because you're like, oh, I'm happy now, so let me go and like interact with the world because in this happy state.
Yeah.
And ideally, what you'd like to do is recognize that the way to deepen the happiness is to ignore even further. We're on like a kind of a bottomless elevator, and want to keep letting it go deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper, and as you go deeper and deeper and deeper, the glittering treasures will become more and more and more attractive and will tempt you with their bliss and joy to touch them. Every time you touch them, you re-engage, and the elevator in some sense shoots up to the top of the surface again, and so then you have to, it'll still become easier and easier nevertheless for it to get back down. But ideally, we'd like to refuse to touch any of those seeming treasures, because we are waiting for the big treasure, which is beyond all of them, essentially. Does that make sense?
Yes, it totally makes sense. It's I called this the bliss of falling, or like
yes.
it's like the really natural depth that's already here. That is this. It's like, oh, everything's already moving according to its nature, and I don't really, I'm actually hampering my own understanding and engagement, effective management of this being, all of it, on and on by engaging.
That's exactly right.
And that's been so,
sorry, Glenn, I'm just going to interrupt you real quick because there's one last question I want to answer really fast. My time's up, if it's okay.
Okay.
So I just asked, how do we know in advance, this is on the chat, before reaching the so-called ultimate state, that an ultimate substratum really exists, other than trusting others who say they've experienced a substratum? Is there any other way? Look, the answer is, there's a big logical substructure, we could discuss. If you want to email me or something like that, we can get into these discussions. I could try to persuade you, but the reality of the matter is, I think that either rings a bell for you or it doesn't. And without that intuitive sense of there's something beyond this, I don't think anyone would engage in the search. So there's no proof that anyone can give you, I think, if you're not so inclined. But that said, I needed a lot of intellectual framework, and if that's something that you need, I definitely would encourage you to read my books and shoot me emails if you want, and we can discuss further. Thank you all, and my time is up, but I really appreciated having you all here today, and I hope you got something out of it. So take care.